The sky was gray, filled with heavy clouds, as if mourning along with the people gathered at Hannah's funeral. The wind blew softly, rustling the leaves of the trees. The crowd stood in silence, listening to Father Michael, who was about to begin the ceremony. Some people clutched handkerchiefs, dabbing at their eyes, while others simply bowed their heads, lost in memories of Hannah. Then, out of nowhere, Duke barked. The sharp sound cut through the silence, making several people jump. Hannah's dog, always known for being calm, stood stiffly near the casket, his eyes fixed on it. His barking grew louder and more urgent, making people exchange nervous glances. "What's wrong with him?" an elderly woman whispered, clutching her rosary tightly. "He senses something," murmured another. Father Michael shifted uncomfortably. He cleared his throat and forced a smile. "It's just a dog," he said, his voice a little shaky. "Someone take him outside." 2 men stepped forward, trying to lead Duke away. But the dog wouldn't move. Instead, he dug his paws into the ground, growling low and deep. His whole body trembled, his eyes locked on the casket. Now, the people were uneasy. A few whispered amongst themselves. Others stepped back, watching Duke with growing concern. David, a stranger to the village who had only arrived a few weeks ago, stepped forward. He had always been observant, and something about Duke's behavior felt wrong to him. "Maybe we should listen to him," David said. His voice was calm, but firm. "Animals don't react like this without reason." Father Michael's smile faltered. He wiped his forehead, shifting his gaze away. "This is a funeral," he said, his voice suddenly harsher. "Let's not be distracted by nonsense." Duke barked again, his tail stiff and his ears pinned back. He looked ready to pounce. His barking grew so intense that even the children in the crowd started to hold on to their parents. Some of the villagers were beginning to look worried. David knelt beside Duke, gently patting his back. "What is it, boy?" he asked in a soft tone. Duke stopped barking for a brief moment, his body still tense. Then, he let out a deep, sorrowful whine and took a step toward the casket. A shiver ran down David's spine. He turned toward Father Michael, whose hands were clenched tightly together. "How exactly did Hannah die?" David asked suddenly. The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The villagers looked at one another. Some frowned, others widened their eyes. Father Michael stiffened. "She passed in her sleep," he answered quickly. "There's nothing more to it." David tilted his head. "And you found her?" "Yes," Father Michael replied, his voice slightly shaky. "Alone?" Father Michael hesitated just a second too long. "Yes." David stood up slowly. "Then why does Duke act like she's still here?" The murmurs grew louder. More people were now staring at the casket, a sense of unease spreading through the crowd. Father Michael took a deep breath, then forced a laugh. "This is ridiculous," he said. "A dog's behavior means nothing. Now, let's focus on paying our respects." David didn't argue, but his gut told him something was off. He could see it in the priest's face, the nervous way he avoided looking directly at the casket, the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. And Duke? Duke wasn't wrong. The dog knew something. David looked back at the casket, and a deep sense of foreboding settled in his chest. Something was very, very wrong. David stayed behind after the funeral, watching as people left in small groups, whispering among themselves. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion, though no one dared voice their thoughts too loudly. Duke sat beside him, still staring at the casket, his body tense. David ran his fingers through Duke's fur, trying to calm him. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. Duke let out a low whimper, his tail twitching restlessly. Father Michael remained at the front of the church, speaking in hushed tones with a few members of the congregation. His eyes darted toward David more than once, his unease evident. David took a deep breath and approached. "Father," he said, his voice level, "I just have a few questions." Father Michael forced a tight smile. "I understand this has been unsettling, but I assure you, Hannah's passing was peaceful. There's no need for any further concern." David met his gaze. "Then why does Duke seem to think otherwise?" The priest's smile faltered for just a moment before he regained composure. "Dogs can sense grief in strange ways." David glanced at Duke, who was still focused on the casket. "That's not what this is," he said firmly. "Duke isn't mourning. He's warning us." A few villagers still lingering nearby turned their heads at David's words. The murmurs started up again, whispers floating through the air like an approaching storm. Father Michael cleared his throat. "David, with all due respect, you're new to this village. You didn't know Hannah the way we did. Her passing was tragic, yes, but natural." David tilted his head. "And you were the one who found her?" "Yes," the priest answered, his fingers tightening around his Bible. "I went to check on her when she didn't come to morning prayer. I found her in bed, peaceful, as if she had simply drifted away in her sleep." David studied the priest. The way his eyes shifted, the way his body seemed tense, it all felt off. His gut told him the priest wasn't being entirely truthful. Then why does Duke act like she's still here? Father Michael's expression darkened. "This is inappropriate," he snapped. "Let the dead rest." David didn't press further, but he had his answer. Something wasn't right, and he was going to find out what. The night was quiet except for the occasional hoot of an owl. The village streets were nearly empty, with only a few flickering lanterns casting long shadows on the cobblestone path. David moved carefully through the darkness, Duke walking beside him, his ears perked up, ready for anything. They were heading to Hannah's house. David had a strong feeling that there was more to Hannah's death than what Father Michael had said. Duke's behavior at the funeral had confirmed it. If Hannah had simply died in her sleep, why was Duke so restless? Why had the priest seemed so nervous? David knew that answers lay somewhere in Hannah's house. When he arrived at the small cottage, he found the door unlocked. That was strange. Had someone been here after Hannah's death? He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. It creaked, breaking the silence of the night. Duke stepped in first, sniffing the air as if trying to catch a scent of something hidden. Inside, the house was untouched but felt eerily still. Dust covered the wooden furniture, and a few candles sat unlit on the dining table. David walked to the fireplace, running his fingers over the mantel. Pictures of Hannah and people from the village were still in place. Everything seemed normal, except for the strange feeling creeping up his spine. "All right, Duke," David whispered. "Let's find out what's going on." Duke sniffed around, moving toward a small bookshelf near the corner of the room. He let out a short bark and scratched at the bottom shelf. David crouched down and pulled out a few books, revealing a wooden box hidden behind them. His heart began to race. Carefully, he took the box and placed it on the table. It was old, the wood slightly cracked with age. There was no lock. David took a deep breath and opened the lid. Inside, he found a bundle of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. The paper was yellowed with time, but the handwriting was still clear. With shaky hands, he untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. It was written by Hannah. * Father Michael is not who he claims to be. I've discovered something terrible. If anything happens to me, do not believe what he says. The truth is in the church. *. David's breath caught in his throat. He quickly flipped through the rest of the letters. Most of them were addressed to someone named M. *. I fear for my safety. I have seen things I shouldn't have. I must tell someone before it's too late. *. Another letter read. *. There is money hidden in the church. I have proof. I saw Father Michael take it. He is not a holy man. He is a thief. *. David felt his stomach tighten. This was more than just a suspicion. Hannah had known something dangerous, and she had tried to warn someone. But who was M? And why hadn't they come forward? Duke whimpered, bringing David back to the moment. He reached out and patted the dog's head. "You were right, boy," he murmured. "Something's not right." He carefully placed the letters back in the box and tucked it under his coat. He needed to get this to the right people before it was too late. But before he could turn to leave, Duke let out a deep growl. David froze. Someone was outside. He moved toward the window, carefully pulling back the curtain. In the dim light, he saw a shadow moving across the street. A figure in a long coat stood near the fence, watching the house. David's heart pounded. Was it Father Michael? Or someone else who knew about the letters? Duke bared his teeth, ready to defend. But David knew they couldn't afford to be caught. Whoever it was, they were watching him. "We need to go," David whispered to Duke. "And we need to be careful." As quietly as possible, he slipped out the back door, making sure to leave no trace of his presence. With Duke by his side, he disappeared into the night, gripping the wooden box tightly. Hannah had tried to expose the truth. Now, it was up to him to finish what she started. David and Duke made their way through the empty village streets under the cover of darkness. The air was cold, and every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Clutching the wooden box of letters tightly, David felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had uncovered something dangerous. Hannah had known the truth about Father Michael, and now, so did he. Their destination was clear: the church. The last letter had mentioned something hidden inside. If Hannah had written about money, corruption, and secrets, there was no doubt that the evidence was inside the very place meant to be sacred. Duke trotted ahead, sniffing the ground as if leading the way. When they reached the large wooden doors of the church, David hesitated. If Father Michael was truly behind all of this, he wouldn't let David snoop around freely. But there was no turning back now. Slowly, he pushed open the heavy doors, wincing as they creaked loudly in the silence. The interior of the church was dark except for the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the stained-glass windows. Everything was still. Too still. David took a deep breath and stepped inside, Duke at his side. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement. His mind replayed the image from the letter: a statue, a hidden compartment, and a secret waiting to be uncovered. He made his way toward the altar, where a row of statues stood tall, carved from cold stone. Each figure had a solemn expression, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. Then, he saw it, the statue from the photograph. It depicted a saint with a sorrowful expression, hands clasped in prayer. Kneeling down, David ran his fingers along the base of the statue, searching for anything unusual. The stone was smooth but slightly worn in some areas, as if it had been moved before. He pressed against it, and to his surprise, a small section shifted. With a firm push, part of the statue's base slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small metal box, covered in dust. David's heartbeat quickened as he reached for it, hands trembling. Duke let out a low growl, sensing the tension in the air. David flipped the latch and opened the box. His breath caught. Inside were neatly stacked bundles of money, each marked with donation slips from the church's congregation. Alongside the money was another folded letter, this one appearing much older. Unfolding it carefully, David read the words written in shaky handwriting. "I know what you have done. You cannot hide forever. The truth will come to light. David barely had time to process the words before a sudden sound made him freeze. Footsteps. He quickly closed the box and turned to see a shadow moving near the entrance. His pulse raced. Had someone been watching him? Had Father Michael known he would come? Then, a familiar voice echoed through the dark space. "You shouldn't have come here, David." Father Michael stepped forward, his face partially hidden in the dim light. His expression was no longer that of a gentle priest. It was cold, calculating. David's grip on the box tightened. "I know what you did," David said firmly. "Hannah found out too, didn't she?" The priest's lips curled into a sneer. "You don't understand what you're meddling with." David took a step back as Father Michael advanced. Duke let out a deep, warning growl, his body tense. The priest glanced at the dog, but didn't seem intimidated. "You stole from the people who trusted you," David continued. "And when Hannah found out, you made sure she couldn't tell anyone." Father Michael's eyes flickered with something unreadable, anger, regret, or perhaps fear. "You have no proof." David held up the box. "This says otherwise." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with unexpected speed, Father Michael lunged forward, trying to grab the box. David stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding him. Duke sprang into action, barking fiercely as he leaped between them. The priest's expression twisted in frustration. "You don't know what you're doing," he snapped. "You think this will change anything?" David steadied himself. "I think Hannah tried to stop you, and you silenced her." A tense silence stretched between them. Then, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from outside. The villagers. Someone must have heard the commotion. Father Michael's face paled. He knew it was over. The doors burst open, and several villagers stormed in, holding lanterns and torches. Their expressions were a mix of confusion and anger as they took in the scene, the hidden compartment, the stolen money, and Father Michael standing there, exposed. "What is going on?" one of the elders demanded. David took a deep breath and held up the letter. "Hannah tried to warn you all," he said. "She discovered the truth. Father Michael has been stealing from the church for years." Gasps filled the room. The priest opened his mouth as if to protest, but the evidence was undeniable. The murmurs turned to shouts, accusations flying through the air. "You betrayed us," someone cried. "How could you do this?" another demanded. Father Michael took a step back, but there was nowhere left to run. The villagers surrounded him, their betrayal turning to anger. The weight of his crimes pressed down on him. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, the facade of a holy man crumbled. The authorities were called, and by dawn, Father Michael was taken away. Justice had finally been served. David stood outside the church, watching the sun rise. Duke sat beside him, tail wagging slightly. The weight of the mystery was gone, but the sadness of Hannah's loss remained. "She would have wanted this," David said softly, patting Duke's head. "She fought for the truth. And now, it's finally out." The village had suffered a deep wound, but the truth had set them free. And as the first light of morning bathed the town in warmth, David knew that Hannah's fight had not been in vain.